All right. So again, you do not need to take any notes or anything like that. Just follow along with me. So this is the start of the third week of this unit. The period is 1450 to 1750. The idea that we're going to come back to, though, right before the semester exam is what should this period be called? We know the ancient period and then the classical period and post-classical. Is this period more accurately described as a late agrarian period, like it's the end of something, or is it the early modern period, like it's the beginning of something? And that's an issue that you're going to have to decide for yourself. But what I want to do right now is sort of look back at the states and empires from the last 2 weeks and how that is related to the trade networks that are developing in this particular time period. So if you go back 2 weeks, chapter 10, I think it was, or 11, I don't even remember anymore. The first chapter of the unit was land empires. And the key idea there was these empires in Eurasia are expanding, but they're also using gunpowder technology, which means they got to find new ways to keep control. Because if people have gunpowder, if they don't want to follow your rule, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to overthrow your rule, right? So when we think about gunpowder empires, it's not they used gunpowders to expand, it's that they had gunpowder, and so the state has to find new ways to control people, okay? And if you recall, we did talk briefly about Europe, but the biggies were the so-called gunpowder empires of the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. Then we compared and contrast Russian expansion with the Qing dynasty, which, by the way, if you notice, that's like the areas that were added and controlled by the Bureau of Colonial Affairs, even though the Chinese didn't settle there. And then we also looked at Japan, which is an island, but it still sort of follows the pattern of the empires having to find a way to centralize their control. So that was what we looked at week before last. Then last week we focused on the maritime empires. Now, I want to make sure we understand this word. Mari is from the Latin word for ocean or sea, right? So maritime empires are European empires that are spread out across oceans. And that's a kind of new thing. We haven't seen anything like that before, but that includes territories in Asia, Africa, but especially in the Americas. Now, that is very closely related to the trade routes that are emerging in this time period. And I'll come back to this before, like when we review before the end of the unit. The easiest way to remember this is 5 S's. Okay? The first S is for spices. Because remember, the main reason Europeans started exploring via the oceans that would eventually lead to the maritime empires is because they wanted a direct route from Europe to the spices in the Indian Ocean, and they didn't want to go through the Ottoman Empire, right? So the first S is the spice trade, which they've always benefited from in Europe, but they never actually directly participated in it. Now they do. And if you remember, the Portuguese tried to make their money by creating a trading post empire and the Cartaz pass system. That didn't work particularly well, but later on, it's the Dutch especially, and then the English will copy the idea of joint stock companies. You create these private companies that represent the state and allow them to pursue profit in Asia. And that seems to be the system that works best for Europeans. All right? So the first S is spices, because that's what's really driving all of that exploration in the first place, trying to get into Asian markets directly. Another S, though, is soft gold, which is a common expression at the time for fur. Now, what's driving this actually started at the end of the last time period, and you might remember the Little Ice Age. There was a global period of several hundreds of years where the global average temperature dropped. It technically is not an ice age at all. It's Little Ice Age just to denote it got colder. As a consequence, fur becomes much more valuable for obvious reasons. But at about the same time is when the North American settlements of the British and French are happening. And so North America becomes the site for this new kind of trade route insofar as it's connecting North America to Eurasia. And I say Eurasia because it's in fact true. British settlements, particularly those in the area that's now Canada, and French settlements in the area of the Great Lakes were primarily for fur trappers. But if you will notice on this image, the Russians are also getting into this game in North America. But they're coming, if you remember, like here's Siberia, they expand to Siberia. And while they're not conquering this territory, they have trappers there trying to get more fur. And if you remember, for the Russian Empire, one of the main things that's fueling that is the conquered people of Siberia had to pay a kind of tribute called yasak, which was tribute in the form of furs. So North America becomes this place where, like, Russia, even though, it started in Europe, most of it is in Asia by this time, and the French and the British are all competing. Here's a key thing to understand about that. That competition gets exploited by the natives of North America, which the Siberians could not do. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine if you're like a Native American in the Great Lakes region and you've got a bunch of furs. You can basically play the French and the British against each other, right? Because they don't really control that territory to the degree that the Russians do in Siberia. Like, they are conquering it, settling it. It's now part of Russia, right? So in the case of Siberia, the Russians just flat out make the people pay in the form of furs, in tribute. But in North America, it's a little bit different situation because it's like, hey, if you don't give me more for my furs, I'll just give them to the other guy. See what I'm saying? Like, there was an advantage there that native North Americans had that native Siberians did not. So, soft gold is the second S. The third S is silver. Now, I don't know if you've put all of this together yet, but it's pretty remarkable when you stop and think about the the coincidental chain of events that have happened here. By the way, this is what we'll be focusing on in class on Thursday and Friday, is how the silver trade affects global things. In many ways, this becomes the first truly global network because Potosi is down here. That's the largest silver mine in the world. The second largest one is up here. But if you notice on this map, I mentioned this last week, half of the silver from Spanish America goes back to Spain, but the other half goes all the way across the Pacific to the Philippines. And if you remember as well, at the same time in Japan, the second largest silver mine is discovered. Now, there's something behind all of this that I don't know if you remember. Does anybody remember the single whip system? What is that? Where? In China, right? The Ming Dynasty starts it, and then the Qing, who are actually Manchu, not Chinese, the Qing just continue it. Why does that matter? Well, because where does all of the silver in the whole world eventually end up? In China. China has by far the largest population in the world, and now everybody, even the lowliest peasant, has to pay taxes in silver. Well, where are they going to get that silver? They're going to have to get it from a money lender, which is another form of merchant. But wait a minute, I thought they're supposed to be. That's the kind of things we're going to look at on Thursday and Friday, because that's going to have huge social consequences as well as economic ones. Here's the point, though, and again, we'll come back to this later in the week. China becomes known as the silver sink. And the reason for that is, if you imagine, like, you have a sink and you fill it up with water, and then you pull the plug, all of the water, it might circle around a couple of times, but all the water is going right through there. That's what happens with the global silver. It all ends up back in China. And then it has all sorts of effects, as we'll see later in the week, not just on Japan, but also on Europe. And so it really is global in a way that we haven't seen before. All right. So review real quick. What was the first S? Spices. The second one? And the third? Okay. The next one is actually two. Sugar and slaves. Because this is what is driving what in middle school you know as the triangle trade, right? Particularly with Britain, but Northern Europe in general, trading manufactured goods for slaves for raw materials. That's the triangle. But as I suggested last week, it's really much more complicated than that. And so in AP history, we don't actually call it the triangle trade. We call it the Atlantic system. Because if you take a quick look at this image, what you notice is there's actually stuff moving in all directions, right? It's not as simple as a one-way, three-legged triangle. Now, we'll talk more about the complexities of this later on in the week, or if not, definitely after Thanksgiving. But there's a couple of things I want to just focus your attention on now, because quite honestly, it's just going to piss me off, okay? First, there's a term you need to know known as the middle passage. It's called the middle passage because in the triangle trade model, it's like here's 1, 2, 3. The middle passage is step 2. And it involves moving human cargo, slaves, from Africa to the Americas. And I need you to really fully appreciate how awful this is. It's so awful that for giant periods of time, more people die being transported from Africa to the Americas than actually die in the Americas. And I need you to appreciate this, because a lot of times people will just say, oh, well, slaves didn't have it so bad. Bull crap. They're not just unpaid laborers. They're slaves. And I need you to understand what exactly that means. First of all, this image right here, if you look, like those are human bodies stacked together like that. I want you to take a look at this one. Can you see what's going on here, top right corner? Like there's 3 people's feet. See them? There's 3 people's heads. There's three more people, three more people, three more people. For 4, 5, 6 months at a time. I need you to understand this. This is not like, oh, that was kind of crappy. What happens when this guy has to pee? He just pees. What happens when this guy has to poop? What happens when this guy gets sick? I mean, I need you to understand, like for months and months at a time, you are packed together like this, wallowing around in everybody else's bodily fluids. It is horrible. There is nothing good about this. Now, let's imagine that you get safely to the Americas. Where are you going? The term that we use for this is called the African diaspora. And if you remember, we've used that word before with the Jewish diaspora. It means spreading. But the obvious difference here is, whereas Hebrews are kicked out of their homeland, Africans are literally moved into their new home, if you want to think of it that way, against their will. This image, though, is really telling because especially we as, members of USA have a different perception of slavery maybe than most people in the Americas. In this image, the larger the circle, the higher the number of slaves from Africa. Where are the most slaves going? Brazil. And then where else? In the Caribbean. This is a blown up of the... Why? What do Brazil and the Caribbean have in common? Sugar. Right? Like again, in our sort of, the narrative we tell ourselves about slavery because it involves the United States, slavery is associated with cotton. But if you look at it globally, it's all about sugar. Sugar is what is driving the slave trade. Why? Well, as I mentioned last week, the work, if you survived the Middle Passage, which you probably are not, then you are being put to work on a plantation doing a job so horrible, you're probably going to die doing that. And this is why in the parts of the Americas where sugar is the basis of their economy, the slaves coming in are constantly coming from Africa. They don't even have time to have children who could then be born into slavery the way that usually happens in North America. They're probably going to die before they have children. You with me? So like, again, what we think of being the narrative of slavery involving the United States, slaves have children and the children are born into slavery, and we'll talk more about that later in the week as well. That's not the way it happened for most of the Americas. It's a constant supply, always coming from Africa. This is why in Brazil, after 1700, over half of the population, they're not just slaves, but they're slaves straight from Africa. It's like this horrible supply and demand. And I say horrible because when you stop it, it's human freaking beings. Here's another thing that I want to just throw out at you to let it sink in about how crappy this is. And again, my whole point here is nothing drives me crazier than people who just, oh, slaves, they didn't have it so bad. They got food and shelter. Really? I want to go back to this image for a moment. Do you realize that ships' captains in the slave trade made mathematical calculations to figure out how many people should they shove into the cargo holds here? X number of people will die in the journey. How many should I have to make sure I have enough that are still alive when I get to the Americas that I can make a profit? I mean, let that sink. Like, that is a horrible, horrible thing when you stop to consider we're talking about human beings. There is a term that you'll learn more about later on. Slavery is not new, guys. It's not new in human history in this time period, right? Europeans did not invent slavery. But as we'll see, they modified it pretty significantly in ways that did not happen before. And one of them is the idea of chattel slavery. They're livestock. That's new. Like, they're not even human beings. They're livestock. And again, we get these crazy calculations like, what percentage of your ship should be women versus men? Because really, it's the men who are going to do the work on your sugar plantation, right? This is the kind of crazy things that, like, at the time, no one stops to think, holy crap, we're talking about human beings. Like, they would actually figure out, okay, what's the correct number of women that I should have to try to make sure I have more slaves born into my property, right? If I have a cow and a bull and they have a baby, that's my baby too. That's my property. Like, trying to do this like humans as livestock, that's a new twist. That is not something that happened in human history before this time. Now, we'll talk more about that in the homework over the week. Slavery is not new and Europeans didn't invent it, but man, there's some new things going on as far as slavery goes. Your homework later in the week then, we'll look at what are the effects of that on African states and societies, right? So mostly we've looked at Eurasia during this time period. We've looked at the Americas during this time period. How does the Atlantic system, which is, we're talking about slavery fueled by the sugar industry, how does that affect the states and the societies that exist in Africa during this time period? So I apologize. This is not like, a pep talk kind of thing, but it's important to, again, put it in a proper perspective because some of these things are hard to think about. They're hard to talk about, but they absolutely happened. And pretending that it didn't happen, A, is not helping you understand history, and B, I would argue, is not helping our society as a whole. So there's my soapbox. That's all for today. You do not have any homework tonight. We will begin the first